Well, thank you all for staying. We do have some really important and I hope interesting information to share with you. Before we start though, Libby asked me to just share something with you. You've noticed that there's some changes going on in the parking lot across the street. It is our parking lot, but the changes that are being made, we are not having to pay for. The township is paying for it. There were some issues with lighting, and so they had to tear out the lighting, and they had to take out all that grass, the island that was there, putting new lighting, and they will be replacing some grass, no, a tree. We're leaving. Okay, so we are wanting to be good stewards and add trees to the area. So we are not paying for it, and so it will be very nice, when it's all finished, and we'll have extra trees. Okay, thank you. So we're going to start. Bruce is going to start with some why we are doing this whole restructure process.
Thank you, John. First of all, it's a real joy for me to be with you. It's been a while since I've seen all of you in this setting. I consider worshiping here at HT sort of my spiritual home away from home. So it's good for me to be here today. I really appreciate it. Okay, I'm sorry, a little hard. Okay. A little bit of history. About 2 years ago, I was asked to come here, and when I told my coaching colleagues and people at this conference I was going to be working here, they said, hey, that's a good church and a good pastor. They're right. You are a good church, and you are a good pastor. You have a good pastor. So it's been my honor, and he says that better? It's been my honor and privilege to work with you. It has been an honor, and I've been excited about it. 2 years ago, I started meeting with you in small groups. I call them listening circles. And as I recall, we had about 85 people that participated, roughly 85. One of the things that you told me, almost all of you told me, that you are tired, that there are too few people to do the work. Some of you told me you feel defeated, that things aren't going as well as you'd like. So I listened to these things, and as you recall, I presented in January of 2020 some ideas to you, one of which was to take a look at your organizational structure and see if that could not be improved to try to alleviate some of that tiredness and some of those feelings of being defeated. Now, before I go any further, I'm going to read to you 3 short passages, so bear with me. They come from Tom Bandy's book, Kicking Habits. It's a great book. I have it with me today, and you can take a look. I do have what I'm going to read to you in copy form, so if you want a copy, you can. Listen to what Bandy says. The inability of declining churches to change has troubling roots. The declining church is an addict. The declining church is an addict. Churches are addicted to habitual, self-destructive behavior patterns, which they do not even recognize. No matter how well-meaning, sincere, and spiritually sensitive the church is, members still cannot bring themselves to admit or see the inner addictions that dictate church life and mission. Addiction is the great barrier to the church in the 21st century. The church cannot simply be renewed. It must be transformed. No programmatic change will overcome addiction. Only systemic change will accomplish that mission. Church transformation is the great task of the church of our time. It is the hope of victory over the destructive addictions which rob our church of life, of meaning, and our church mission of relevance. I read that to my wife. She said, ugh, that's terrible. Why does he use the word addiction? You don't want to tell him that, Bruce. Let me explain. Here's what Bandy is trying to say. And I'm going to do this in a parable I'm sure this is a parable that many of you have heard, and I apologize to you for that, but it really has significant meaning for here. Here's how the story goes. A young lady is watching her mother prepare a roast. And the mother cuts this roast in 2 pieces and puts it in a pan. And the young woman has watched her mother do this many times. And after a while, she said to herself, I wonder why she's cutting that into 2 pieces. That would easily fit in the pan. So the mother says, well, the reason we're doing that is because grandmother did that. That's all she offered. So the girl thought, well, the next time at Grandma's house, I'm going to ask. So she went to the grandmother a little bit later, and she said, by the way, Grandma, I talked to Mom, and she said that she cuts those roasts in 2 pieces and puts them in the pan, and she said, because you did it. And the grandmother starts to laugh. She said, yeah, I did that because my pan wasn't big enough. But your mother and you have bigger pans. That's the addiction that he's talking about. That's what really he has in mind. When churches are doing things just because they've been done that way in the past, we are not serving ourselves well. And I've been blessed when I talk to you folks about looking at structure. The pastor put a team together, a fantastic team, a really fantastic team. Let's see, Carol, right over here, Mel, sitting close to me, and Nancy. And I enjoyed working with them. And what I did with them is start to show them what typically is church structure. And yours was typical. And then I showed them a transformational model. And they looked at me and said, oh, wow, that's pretty radical. And it is. But what they did, which was neat, they took a look at both of those models, and they come up with what I think is transformational that they're going to present to you. But it's unique to this congregation. It borrows a little bit from both worlds. And I think it's a change that is not just problematic, it's systemic. It is going to help a great deal. So again, it's been my privilege to work with these 3 people, and I'm not going to say anymore. They're going to tell you what the changes are. And if you have any questions down the road, if I need an answer, I'm going to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, Bruce, and thank you for all of your guidance over this last year and a half that we've been working on it, because we have had questions upon questions, and you've been very patient with us. So if you look at your handout to start, on the side it says current structure of church. So this just delineates how we have our structure right now. And you'll see at the top it says consistory. So right now that is the only real body that we have. It's legislative and administrative. Each member is also a committee chairperson, except for the president and the secretary, but everyone else is a chairperson. They meet most months. They approve all major changes, budget, and programs. Each committee chair gives the report each month. We review the financial statements. The pastor shares the activities of the previous month. There are normally 9 members, so that each committee has the chair, and there are 3 officers. And then the committees I have listed below, which you're probably familiar with. So that the chair of each one of those committees is on consistory. So if you'll turn it over and see the proposed new structure. So I'm just going to talk about the consistory part of it. So consistory, instead of being 8 or 9 members and meeting every month, would be 5 or 6 members meeting maybe 4 times a year. And what I think is the best part of this is they would not also be chair people. So if someone who would like to be on consistory, but isn't on a committee and doesn't want to chair a committee, would still be more than welcome to be on consistory. And vice versa, if you would like to be a committee chair, but you have no interest in being on consistory, you could do that as well. So it would open it up to more people. I mean, when we had hundreds of people, it worked fine. This is what we need to look at as we have a smaller congregation. So we can't be looking, we don't have as many people to choose from that can take these positions. So if you'd like to be one thing but not the other, you can do that now. I'm going to pick on Eleanor because I know she won't mind. Eleanor loves the ACT committee. She has a real passion for outreach, and she is a wonderful ACT chairperson. But she has told me, consistory, I don't really like being on. I don't like that part of it. I don't want the financial part. I'm not interested in that. But because she's the chair, that's the other part of what she does, is she's on consistory. And there's going to be people who would like to be on consistory, but they've never been on a committee, so they can't really chair a committee that you've never been on. If you don't have that passion for it, you can't chair it. But you might like to be on consistory. So now we're separating those. That's one of the big things, I think. And it doesn't put as much of I hate to use the word burden. I don't like to think that we're burdened by these things, but I'll use that word. You don't have to do both. You don't have to be this chairperson and a consistory member. So more people may be interested. It's less work. Okay, so the reason that the consistory would meet less often is that we would like to have more congregational meetings. Like we've been doing this year. We've really had quite a few this year. So for some of the big decisions, like this one, we will be taking that to the whole congregation. So we've done that several times now, so that the whole congregation gets to hear the new ideas that whoever is thinking about, and has a chance to really hear all the information and then vote on it, rather than just the 5 or 6 members of consistory hearing it and then voting on it. And other people may not necessarily really know the whole, all the details. So consistory would meet as needed 4-ish times a year, and congregation would meet as needed several times a year. I mean, there's no set number because maybe we won't have anything to decide. We've had a lot of things to decide this year because there's been a lot of changes and COVID and all that. But it depends on what kind of decisions are needed to be made, when we need. So again, this allows everyone to have the opportunity to hear the changes and to have a voice in the decision rather than just consistory. Okay, so that's the changes for consistory. And so we're going to go through, all three of us, the different things, and then when we're all finished, then we're certainly going to open it up to any questions, which I'm sure you might have.
You heard earlier this morning when Pastor Libby said how difficult it is to streamline a presentation, make it short. I'm not burdened by that affliction. So this will be a relatively brief presentation. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the administrative team. The concept of the administrative team basically is to run the nuts and bolts, the daily operation of the church. I mean, we've had this being done for many years, and just so we're clear, I don't think the administrative team, as it is proposed, necessarily changes much of what we're doing in terms of persons making decisions and recommendations concerning the budget. People making decisions and recommendations concerning the maintenance of the property or personnel issues that arise. We're putting it together in what's called an administrative team that is conceptually proposed to be 6 members. Again, I think we need to emphasize this is a work in progress. We sat down as a committee with some guidance from Bruce to get to a recommendation to the church. And basically, I look at this, I mean, one of the things that was discussed earlier was transparency, the thing that somehow people feel detached and not involved. We've had at least a reduction in the size of this congregation. I mean, when years ago, we had 16 members on consistory. It'd be very difficult, and it is difficult, to maintain a consistory of 16 persons. But it's not that difficult to get together as a congregation and talk about issues. It's almost kind of like a family sort of approach to this sort of thing. But we need somebody that is going to be able to handle the day-to-day responsibilities that people are doing on the property committee now, the finance committee, and all of those things will kind of be rolled into the administrative team. It doesn't mean, and nobody here is necessarily, I mean, there may be some people, but nobody is well-versed in property, finance, personnel, all of the things that go into this, but people have different strengths. And while the handout suggests that we could eliminate certain committees, I think it's important that maybe the way we're looking at this is not so much to have the formalistic structure of saying, this is a committee that deals with this is a committee that deals with that. We have an administrative team that can call on the resources of everybody in the congregation who has strengths to be able to help implement things or just to bounce things off of, but ultimately it's the administrative team that comes back with the recommendations, the budget, personnel type of situations, all of those related property things that if they require decisions are made then by the congregation, because what isn't as much identified here is the congregation will, under this model, hopefully meet on a more regular basis, much as we are meeting here today, maybe 4 or 5 times a year to discuss and to make decisions on things that we may need to make decisions on. So the concept is really to just kind of encompass and bring more people into the decision-making process so that it doesn't seem as obtuse, it doesn't seem as detached. It really truly involves the congregation as a whole. So the administrative team is going to run that day-to-day operation, if you will, or at least be the point person or point committee for doing that, but it will still operate much as we see it today. So that's the concept of the administrative team. I think Nancy's going to talk a little bit about the nominating committee.
Good morning. Mine's going to be even shorter and sweeter. Mine is the nominating committee, and that is exactly what that means. It is a group of 3 people that would be appointed by the consistory, reporting directly to the congregation, with nominations for candidates that they think would be appropriate for consistory members and administrative team members whose terms were expired. So they would be looking at the strengths and talents of congregation and looking to see who would best might be interested in filling a position that's coming open. Members would be appointed for 3 years. We're seeing a trend of 3 years. And basically working the last few months of the year when it's time to start thinking about new members as terms expire. That's the nominating committee.
Thank you. Right now, we don't really have a very good way of picking people. And I'm going to, again, give an example with Eleanor. When I was on the consistory before, I was the chairperson for ACT, and then my term was up. So what I had to do, and I guess this is what everybody does when their time is up, I had to look in my committee, which is only a few people, who could be the chairperson and also be on consistory. And it was just sort of up to me to find somebody to replace myself from consistory. So, fortunately, when I asked Eleanor, she agreed to do it. So that's, that's not a very good way to have to go from one to the other, for someone just to have to find it themselves. And in this case, in the new way, we won't have to find somebody that's on the committee. The nominating committee can look at everybody and know their strengths and talk to them and approach different people that have not been as active in these things. So I think it will be, I think it will be a great change. So we have had, when we were talking to Bruce, we've been honestly talking about this for well over a year and a half with questions. So I'm sure you have some questions, so please come, and then whoever is appropriate, we will answer. Maybe. I don't know, but is this on? The green light is on. Hello? Okay. Hello? No, this one's done. Okay, so we'll stand here, that's fine. So, questions, we will try to answer them, but one of the four of us will hopefully be able to answer. Gary? Oh, I'm sorry.
So I will ask one question that you just ended with is the structure. If we were to make an organization chart, now the way it is, we have a consistory, and then we have the chairpersons of each
Committee.
function, reporting on consistory. And reporting the activity in that particular function to the system, so that the county is represented and the act is represented and so on. So that's, I think somewhat of the current structure. Whereas here,
We might need for
This one doesn't work? Oh, it's working now. I don't know.
Okay, I'm on. But, no, I was saying that right now, the structure is that theoretically, there is a chairperson of each of the particular committees, the property, the worship, the preschool, something, that has a member of that, which is the chairperson of the subcommittee, basically, on consistency, so that the problems and the individual doings of that particular committee reported consistently. And then the consistency votes. There are a lot of things that require a consistency vote. It doesn't go right there. This is not made, so, okay, we're doing it. It goes consistently. And in this structure here, where does the administrative team report to consistency? Where's the business of the administrative team? Or is that necessary? I mean, how it's going to be done?
The consistory would be the legislative branch, as we call it. So if there needed to be a decision made, then yes, it would have to go to consistory. If a vote needed to be made, then it would go to consistory. And someone, anybody can come to consistory meetings, so if they had a need, they would come to the meeting and present it, and then they would have to vote. The administrative, and I think maybe you were also asking about the committee chairs being able to share. But they could, if they had a report, they certainly could, would send a report in. Okay, sorry. Some of the committees I think, will not need to be, there won't need to be so many committees, because the finance committee is now the financial part of it will now be incorporated into the administration, so that there won't be that committee. Those people still may help out, but it won't, the administration will organize it. The preschool, they'll help, whatever the liaison to the preschool, they will be there. So there won't be a preschool committee. I should have brought this up. And property. So there won't be a property committee per se, because administration will be handling that. Doesn't mean they'll be doing the work. So just because a person chooses to be on the administrative team doesn't mean they're going to do all the work. They're going to be then organizing. So something needs to be done on the property, they will be the one to organize and get volunteers to help do that. So there won't be as many committees. There certainly will need to still be the ACT committee and the fellowship committee. And they can make a report, but those committees don't usually need approval of anything. But if they do, they certainly can come to a consistory meeting or the congregation and have something approved. Does that answer your question enough, do you think? I don't want to be a politician, and not answer questions. I want to say one thing about the experience of my being the president. Whenever I've thought multiple times this year, this is a good reason that we should have an administrative committee. Whenever there's a question that comes up, it comes to me. Like I'm the only person, currently because I'm the president, but the president is the only person that really the pastor has to go to and say, what do you think about this? What about this? What about this? What about this? They're not things necessarily that we have to take to consistory, which we do plenty. But one person has a lot of saying, well, I think we should do it this way. I think we should do it that way. It's just the president. So an administrative team will be the day-to-day kind of thing that when the pastor has a question about something, it can go to that administrative team rather than the one person that happens to be the president at the time. It's really too much decision-making for one person to make, I think.
I agree with you 100%. You shouldn't have to be able to answer that question. Unfortunately, that's the way we fall.
Right.
It's not what really is the way it originally was.
Well, that could be.
Because you're very confident. Knowledgeable person, and automatically people want answers and they go to the person. It's very informal relationship. But yes, it's the way it goes. Not necessarily the way it's intended. And
Well, yeah, that could be.
So what you're saying is eliminating that? Is there going to be a president of consistory? Is there going to be a leader of consistory?
Yes, there will still be a president of consistory because they lead the consistory meeting. Yes, and that person will still, when things come to to their. When someone shares with them something that they need to take to consistory, then they'll need to do that. Yeah, there will still be. But the day-to-day running of the church, really, will be more in the administrative team. And when small groups come, if they have any kind of requests, they will come to the administrative team for help, if they need help. Like if they need money, the administrative team will make that decision. The consistory will be, like I said, the legislative branch. Right now, it does both, pretty much. So we're trying to get people to do less, so that if you agree to do something or have a desire, I don't want to make it sound like it's a burden. If you have a skill or a desire to be one of these things, you aren't having to do so much. You aren't having to be a leader of a committee and on the consistory. You might just want to do some of those pieces. So all of them will be a little less time-consuming, and that's really the goal, is for them to be less time-consuming. And I've said this before, Bruce says this, we want to ease up people from doing church so that we can be the church. Okay, I saw a hand. Yes, hand.
Could you distinguish for us what decisions the congregation as a whole would be making and what consistory would be making?
Well, I don't know that I can necessarily delineate that. I would say the bigger ones would be brought to the brought to the congregation. Bigger things that we want input from everyone. I don't. Maybe that take more finances, maybe that's going to be a bigger change. Certainly something like this. We wouldn't want to have taken this to consistory and have 5 people decide we're going to change the whole structure of the church. We didn't want to take it to the consistory to decide about the endowment fund. That's why we had all those meetings last year. So this isn't real specific, but the bigger ones that are going to change more, we would bring to the...
My question is, I hear those big changes in the word
just, we have to take that as it comes. That is what they'll be doing. They will be making decisions and saying yes and no to more of the smaller things. Every little thing that's decided, I don't think has to come to the whole congregation. But, because we vote on things sometimes that, are pretty straightforward, but they still need to go through the consistory. So they'll make those. Yes, Libby?
An example perhaps be like, maybe perhaps an example of that would be when the parking lot proposal came, we
Yeah.
just sent that to the consistory because that was kind of a no-brainer. It didn't take money, it was somebody fixing it for us.
Yeah.
But perhaps if we had a big major improvement here on the building that had to take a lot of money, we would then hold a meeting, correct? And then the congregation.
Yeah, that's a good example, because that would just happen. So that talk about the parking lot, there wasn't really much to decide, but we didn't want to just do it without anybody knowing, without anybody giving approval. So we sent that out and got a vote, and, of course, everybody agreed. But that's a pretty minor thing. We don't need to involve the whole church to say we're going to change the parking lot a little bit. So, yeah, that's a good example. Is that, and I think they're not cut and dried. This is going to come to the congregation and this is going to come to consistory. I think we would make that decision by how important it is, how much, if it takes a lot of money, if it takes a lot of resources of any kind, we would bring it to the congregation. So one of the things Bruce was saying, that we made this is sort of a hybrid situation, that in some, I don't know if when he was explaining it to us, it's possible that you wouldn't even have a consistory, okay, but we decided that was a little bit too dramatic to change right now, that we would just not have consistory and always have meetings in the church. Would just always, the whole congregation would decide everything. But anyway, we decided that was maybe too drastic. So this is sort of a hybrid thing. We still have the consistory. We're going to have it all, set up basically the same. They would meet whatever they needed to 4 times a year, say. And then, the other meetings in the congregation. And maybe, so let me say another couple things. So if we decided to approve this, we would suspend our bylaws, because our bylaws are very specific about things that we're not going to be following anymore. So if we voted on this and decided to try it, we would suspend those bylaws for 3 years and give this a try. And at the end of 3 years, we said, well, that doesn't work, or maybe we could tweak it this way, or whatever the case may be. We would come back, have another meeting. Everybody would talk about, put their input, and then we would make a decision. No, we don't like it. This could be changed, whatever. So this is what we would propose is a 3-year trial. Yes, Frank.
If a person wants to, may that person serve on both the consistory and the administrative team?
I think so. I don't know. That'd be a great problem to have. I think so. I can't see why there would be a conflict in that. Bruce?
That's a good question. The question was, could a person serve in both your consistory and your administrative team? The technical answer is yes, they could. However, one of the real purposes of doing this is getting more people involved in the activities of the church and of the doing of the church. So yes, it's possible, it could be permitted, but probably the nominating committee would say, gee, we'd like to get more people involved, not fewer. Does that make sense? Okay, so my guess is your nominating committee would say, well, there's a vacancy on the administrative team. I don't think I want to go to a consistory member to fill that. I'm going to think about the whole congregation and say to myself, who could be a good replacement there? And it might be someone who hasn't done that many things in your congregation in the past, but they've been a faithful attending member, and you'd go to them and say, hey, we have a job for you. The nominating committee is very successful when they do things by invitation in person. That's when they're successful. And And when they really put a lot of thought into this and say, okay, who are the people in this congregation? What are their strengths and weaknesses? And by the way, there are intentional ways of finding that out, and we've talked about that. But then the committee says, gee, who would be the best person to fill this slot at this time? Yes, they could serve in both. It's probably not a great idea.
Any other questions? John? Let me just say, we're going to run this as a Zoom meeting, not this Monday, not tomorrow, but the next Monday. There were people who were interested but didn't feel they were really wanted to come back to church yet, so we are going to run that as well. And then in January, I believe, we're going to have a vote. We want people to be able to give this some thought. It's a big decision. Of course, we want to have both meetings. And then in January, when we have our vote for the budget, we will also have a vote for this. Okay, John.
Not so much a question as a comment. Our congregational meetings tend to be rather comfortable. There's some proposal and a very brief amount of discussion. I think the nature of our congregational meetings will need to change. There's this way of doing it.
Well, I think that the experience of the last few, though, has not been that way. I mean, when we talked about the new staff person, there were many questions. There's been many questions here. Yeah, and there were lots of questions and comments. I think what I am thinking about, and what probably you're thinking about, is when we have the budget. I don't think as many people feel comfortable asking questions about the budget. I mean, I would agree when we have those meetings about the budget, there aren't very many questions. I think partly they trust the people who have made the budget. They feel those people know more about it than they themselves do, and so most people don't comment, and I totally agree with that. But I would also say the last year, when we have had congregational meetings like this one, we've had good questions. Yeah, so I think, and partly when we were 150 people meeting, probably people felt more intimidated to ask questions, whereas now when there's 30 people, in fact, I was thinking we should have moved closer together, but anyway, it doesn't matter. I think people are, just feel a little freer to ask when there's less people. Yeah. Do you agree with that? I mean, is that?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
I'm glad to see that change happening already, and I think that continues to do more.
Okay, great. Gary.
Just one more thing. I do agree with what you said. But church growth, I mean, this is what we talked about 2 years ago and going forward, but where does that fit into the structure? That's an essential part of our whole existence in the city. To grow the church, I thought.
Well, I'm not sure that the structure per se has anything to do with growing the church. I do think this is a better way of involving people who do come into the church, because they will be asked by the nominating committee, once we learn some of their strengths and their desires, they will be asked. There's lots of people who probably have never been on any of these in consistory ever, because they're not on a committee. Okay, so that really limits who can be on consistory. But if someone comes in the church and they, we get to know them, we find out their strengths, there may be there's more places for people now, and they don't have to do as much. We're not asking people to do as much, but we're asking more people to do less.
I guess what I'm saying is, where does the application of the church growth utilize and still fit in these groups.
Yeah, sure.
'Cause I don't know.
I agree with you, Gary. I think the situation, part of this situation is that one of the attractions of the church, I can do that. I can talk loud enough, but I'll go over here. One of the attractions of a church and a structure like this is that we're reaching out and saying, this congregation is involved, all right? So we have to presuppose that somebody that's coming to this church or is interested in coming to this church is going to be attracted by the idea that we have maybe taken a much more core approach to congregational involvement than we may have in the past. I agree totally with John. I think the nature of congregational meetings need to change, all right? I mean, for those persons who have been here a long time, Ted, Mariana, we used to have congregational meetings with 125 people, and we'd talk about the budget and that sort of thing, and Margie knows this. One person would stand up, Ken Kreider, all right? Ken Kreider would stand up and ask a question, and he'd be the one person to ask a question about everything. Nobody else would. That either means somebody was doing a very good job or everybody relied upon the people that were involved. And I think the point here is that we're saying, as I understand it, that when there was a survey, there were people that were saying, I feel detached, I don't feel as involved. And this is an opportunity, I think, to try to be more involved. It may not work. There's a possibility it may not work. It may not achieve all of the objectives, but I think that in fairness, looking at it, as I said earlier, when we had 16 persons on consistory, you wouldn't get 16 persons today to be on consistory. It's just inevitably not going to occur. So the idea of all of this was to try to structure a model that would allow the congregation to be more involved and hopefully to go out and you know, Bruce used that term of be the church rather than doing church and try to attract people in that manner. Will it necessarily correlate to a church growth program? Can't say that it will, but I think anybody coming in is going to say, hey, anybody that's here is actively involved, and that's the hope with this type of thing, at least as I view it. I don't know that it's going to mean that we adopt this structure and suddenly there are 11 new persons that are in the church. But I think we can at least provide, it seems to me, an attraction to say, you have an opportunity to be involved, all right? And they're going to see that by coming, and if we have 4 or 5 congregational meetings in the course of a year, they don't have to come all that long before they have an opportunity to observe a congregational meeting and hopefully say, hey, this looks like a good thing. So that's the hope. Is it a guarantee? No guarantee, but that's the hope. Yes, Barb.
I agree with what you just said now. I mean, when we have consistent, I always like to have this involved in that. But it's always hard for people that don't want to come on. And so there's many times and many years that you've had the same people on because nobody would fill in when you get time going on. And then there were comments, and I remember from the surveys and the different meetings we had, one of the thing problems people were saying is, how come it's always the same group of people running the church? And so this, I think this is an awesome opportunity for the church to grow. And if it fails, well, we try.
I think that's a great point. I think it's a great point, Barb. I will say the only thing I will, in defense of those persons that do it and people who make the criticism that, well, I don't have an opportunity to be involved. If you step up and say, I guarantee to you, anybody here to raise their hand today and say, I want to be involved, okay, tomorrow morning by 11 o'clock, they'd be integrally involved in whatever the situation is. So I always find that a little Monday morning quarterbacking myself. You know, don't complain about the fact I don't get a chance to be involved, that Carol's doing it all, or Joe's doing it all, or Sally's doing it all, because if you wanted to do it, you could do it, okay? It's, you know, that's the situation. But here is an opportunity, it seems to me, for us to kind of put our money where our mouths are and say, let's try to do this situation. May not be perfect, because I have to admit, Ann, I get a little, I have a difficulty in my own mind blurring the distinction between what consistory decides and what congregation decides, and maybe even what the administrative team does. And I'm going to stand up here I'm going to tell you, I've been sitting in the committee for a year and a half. I'm still not sure I understand all of that. And I think, but it's going to be something that I think we have to feel our way through, okay? You know, Pastor Libby talked today about, you know, having a child, et cetera. When you're your first parent, you don't know it all, okay? You kind of tread lightly, you make some mistakes, you do that. Maybe by the third, you certainly change some things, okay? So I think the idea here is that not that what we have isn't working, the idea is whether what we have now, can we make it work better, recognizing what we now have, the realities of the situation, that we don't have 125 people in the pews, but we have very dedicated people that are in the pews. So that's the hope, that, at least as I view it.
That explanation from Mel was very good. The question Gary raised is, how does this have impact on church growth? The impact is indirect. What it does is eliminate or lessen the number of people that have to be involved in church administration, which is cumbersome work, hard work. It frees more people to be out into the community spreading the gospel. So one of the answers, it frees people. But the other thing this congregation has done, which directly relates to church growth, is to develop a small group ministry. There is no better way of growing your church than small group ministry, because it involves people from the outside establishing a relationship with some of your members, and then eventually, if they want to, becoming part of the bigger fellowship. The small group ministry is absolutely critical. Your congregation is one of the few I've ever worked with that's willing to do it on a congregation-wide basis, and they are going to start doing that more intensively in the very near future. Does that answer your question? Okay. The question that was back here, I think it was John raised the question about the differences that you're seeing in congregational meetings and this. I always, in my terminology, consider these a congregational gathering. They are for the purpose of explaining things to everybody. In this case, you had a team that worked on this for over a year. They're now explaining it to you. You're not taking any votes today, and you're asking a lot of questions. Eventually, January, you're going to have a chance to vote on this. So that's called a congregational decision-making process, where things are brought to you in a non-threatening way. People can ask questions, and then eventually there will be a vote. Now, that's a lot different than the way normal churches work. A lot of them would work by taking something to consistory looks at it, brings it to a congregation for a vote. And my dad would have said, "What in the world? I don't know a thing about this." So here, they're giving you a chance to learn all these things, and eventually you will vote on them in a meeting. Does that make some sense? Thank you.
I'm so glad Bruce brought up the subject of small groups, because I know this is about structure, but I have, I think, a practical question. Last year, a few of us out of the climate group wanted to start planting pollinator-friendly and native plants around our church as part of the whole climate issue. And I kind of spearheaded that, and I thought, well, where do I go? How do I get permission? I can't just come out here with a group of people and start digging up the garden. So I'm wondering, in small groups, I'm hoping are going to be just start to flourish in this church. If somebody has an idea for something they want to do, tell me with this new structure how we go about getting that established. The small group that did the planting last year, that's what I call phase 1. I'm already raising questions about phase 2 for the next growing season, and I have no idea who do I go to now to ask permission to do that, to plant a tree possibly, and where would I get funding to help with this? Last year, it just came up
it's a really, really good question, and I'm glad that you brought it up, because that would be the job of the administrative team, as long as it's within the scope of the church, the beliefs of our church. If you brought something that wasn't something that we believed as a church, then we would have to have a problem. We would have a problem with that. But if you bring something, if anybody brings something to the administrative team, as Bruce says, they would say, yes, how can we help? So if you needed funds, we would see if there were funds available and, already in the budget possibly. If it needed to be maybe something that was larger that might need to go to the endowment fund, then we would help with that process of requesting money. But as long as it's in the mission of the church, all small groups are welcome to move forward with their plans. But they would come to the administrative team so that somebody knows what's going on. So is that right, Bruce? Yes? Okay. Okay.
Your administrative team is not a permission-giving body. That's your consistory. But to answer Eleanor's question, if a small group thinks they need something or to make their ministry work better, they would go to the administrative team, and the first question that team always asks is, how can we help you? Now, if they're asking for something that is a major change, the administrative team is not going to say you can do it or you can't do it. They're going to take that to your consistory. The administrative team is only there to help facilitate ministry. And quite frankly, you don't need to get permission for a lot of your small groups. If they're within the framework of the mission of your congregation, you don't have to. A good example is the walking group. May I use it? Carol was involved in starting a walking group. There was nobody that gave permission for that. Oh, okay, so I'm sorry. They started it, but they had a couple people, one or two, that were not part of your congregation that were involved in that. And that's what's important about small groups, getting people beyond your congregation to be involved in a shared activity that everybody loves, that involves some of the people from the outside and some of your folks. And I believe as a result of that, and you can correct me, at least one of those people attended here. That's church growth, Gary. That's how it works. You build a relationship first, and then people eventually decide to be part of your congregation or not. We have reversed that in the modern church. We've said belief first, and we'll establish relationships later. That's very true of the guys in black suits that knock on the door. They're asking you to come in right away to be part of that church. Unfortunately, today, the vast people out there are totally unchurched. And I mean totally unchurched. They couldn't tell you what happens in a church to save their life. So you have got to establish a relationship with them first. And then, hopefully, they become involved in your congregation. A very dear friend of mine who works at Church of the Good Shepherd always said it this way: you go from the secular to the sacred. For a lot of people, they don't have a lot of sacred knowledge. You've got to establish the relationship first, and that's where the church growth comes from. But the administrative team doesn't give permission for that. They just say, how can we help you? Now, if you ask for $100,000 to do your job, they're going to say, we don't have $100,000. Now, if you want to take that to consistory of the congregation, maybe they'll take out a loan. I don't know. But they don't give permission at all. They just facilitate the ministry. Does that make sense, Eleanor?
Yes, and I understand what you're saying, but forming a walking group is different than keeping them around your church. And, I think you're doing
Let me use that concrete example. Eleanor's talking about, I believe, your climate group, part of it, and they were making changes around the church as far as plannings. Now, that is different from a walking group. If you took that to the administrative team, all that they would probably explain to you is what's permitted and what's not permitted by established practice. That they would say, well, wait a minute, you can't put that here because we've said we don't want that. So they're not giving permission, they're just explaining to you what the parameters are. Now, if you want to go beyond that and you think you need permission for something, they're going to guide you to the consistory and say, well, we can't give you permission. We're not permission giving, but we'll say to you, you better go to the consistory and get that permission. If not, they'll just interpret your current guidelines and say, yeah, it's okay, go ahead. I mean, how can we help you with it? Do you need a load of bark mulch, whatever?
So it's like a change of command. She wants something to go to the ministry, or then you go to the consistory. Will the consistory, would the congregation go for what she wants?
No. Let me explain that a little bit further. It's not really a chain of command. The administrative team would not have to go to anybody if what that group is asking for is well within the boundaries of what you like to do. Now, if it requires a change to those protocols or to those common practices, that would have to go to your consistory or your congregation. There was a question over here, Anne, I believe, asked what the difference is. What goes to a congregational meeting and what goes to consistory? For every congregation, that's different. What you consider critical to go to the entire congregation, Quentin UCC might not. Does that make sense? So the pastor and you have to know what are flashpoints for your church. Something this big goes to the congregation. If I was on consistory, I'd say, whoa, that's well beyond what we can do. Remember what the word consistory actually means in one sense. It's the congregation at interim. So the congregation is your final authority. And they would meet more frequently, and they would make decisions on things that are a little bit bigger, like this, or like changing your endowment. Now, if it's just a matter of we have to spend $1,000 to fix the roof, a consistory can handle that. Does that make a difference? But what is important to you for an entire congregation might not be important to anybody else, another congregation. Recently, Quentin spent $75,000 to repave their parking lot. That went to the congregation. Okay? Does that make sense? Smaller things, no. I'll give you an aside. This is why I value your congregation so much. I had a congregation approach me 2 weeks ago and said their committee structure is in shambles. They had 105 committee slots and an attendance of 30. And they're saying, we can't get anything done. So I said, well, they said, I think we need to rewrite our bylaws. Think about what Bandy said. That's a pragmatic approach. I offered them a transformational approach, like I offered you. They looked at me and said, we never did things that way, and we're not going to try. That's exactly what they said. We'll keep doing it the old way. Was the old way working? No. You are a neat congregation. You're at least considering transformation, at least considering a better way of doing things, a way that will allow more people to be involved. And I'm really proud of you for that. I really am. It's neat to work with a church that's at least willing to consider that, as opposed to someone that says to me, we don't want to do that. Thank you.
We had a meeting, I don't know, a few months ago where everybody was asked for suggestions. Now, when will we get an answer to those suggestions, or do we have pathway to answer or give feedback on suggestions?
As a small percentage of the suggestions, that went to the owner.
We had down the basement, that one, or down the social hall? Well, we recorded all those and we listed them, and that is more of a church growth. Those were ideas to get for small groups and to get church growth. So this structure isn't going to be making decisions on those. I mean, that's for groups, to decide. I mean, I'm not sure if
No, I'm still really amazed on that situation, because people suggest different things.
right?
Okay. If they don't get a response, we're all adults, somebody can sit down opposite me and say, I don't think that would work here because. But to ignore suggestions consistently will shut down suggestions. They need responses.
Well, first of all, I don't know that we know everybody we didn't record who suggested what, so we're not going to be able to go to each person and say, you suggested square dancing, and we're not going to do that. So I don't know that, we don't have a name with each suggestion. What actually maybe the answer is the empowerment, which is, we've changed the name to the empowerment group, which is now going to be, what is it? Yeah, but aren't we changing it to, the empowerment team that has been working for the last year and a half, that's really who put that on. I just happened to be part of that too, so I was there. But they're the team that is looking forward to, but that's not part of this particular structure, okay? That's another team that is, what's the word I want to use though? Before it was empowerment, it is, there's like long-range planning, that's what I want to say. Long-range or strategic planning, that's what I want to say. So those ideas were for those people to consider. And that's another committee right now. And they have those, we recorded them all, we have them all, and that's for them to be considering in the future. Yeah, they're all under consideration. Yeah, I mean, none of them are going to be said. I'm not saying we're going to do them all, but I mean, they're all being considered. But we don't know who said what, so no one's going to come to you and say that idea you had is not going to happen, because they're just recorded, not by names. So they're all still there, and that group will look into them, but that won't affect this. Well, I mean, this structure will have something to do with it. If somebody comes and says, we want to do such and such, they'll take their information to the administrative team, and they will help in whatever way they can, or get help, suggest help, unless it needs something more, and then it would go to consistory. But this group won't really be making those changes. These are facilitating changes.
And Lynn, the other thing I want to add is that a lot of the suggestions that were on that, I think the small group committee is going to be finding ways that empower people. A lot of ideas that were on there were small group ideas. And so what we need, because the empowerment committee cannot take on all the tasks. We need people that say, I am really passionate about this. Who do I turn to get this started? And so that would be, if it's a small group ministry, you would turn to the small group team, which Eleanor is a part of. If it's empowerment, you would turn to the empowerment team. But for the most part, I think that this frees us up to say, I am ready to roll with this, like the climate change group or the walking group. They were ready to roll, and all we need to do is give them the wheels and say, roll. And I think that's I think the whole restructure had to take place first because right now the structure is they have to go up before the consistory. So once we restructure, we can free up people to say, you're inspired as long as it's meeting goals and not taking away from the ministry and missions, the growth plans that we have. We might not want anti-Semitic groups meeting here, for instance. We need to make sure that things are aligned with our values. But we want to have people become the body of Christ.
Does that answer your question?
Okay, just one other thing. You have an idea of this this is down the road, you know, when we get all this straightened out.
Uh-huh.
You have an idea, you would form a small group, or you would need to go to the consistory. Who would you go to say, this is my idea?
The administrative team would then say, you know, would consider, is that part of the mission of our church? Like Libby said, if you had an idea that, you know, that doesn't fit with what we believe, an anti-Semitic group, which I'm sure you're not going to do, then they would say, well, what do you need? You know, what do you need? How can we help you? But they're not going to do it. You know, if you have an idea, then of course you would want to find other people in the church that might help you, or we might be able to, or not we, the administrative team might be able to help you if you needed some concrete, you know, so a room to use, or, you know, something like that. It would just help you with that. But they're not going to do that. Yeah, they're just going to, yeah.
If you want something done or have an idea, knowing that you would have to do it, but the process you would have to go through to get a yes or no, yeah, we can do it, no, you can't.
And then there's eventually going to be more organization with the small groups, which Eleanor and Flora are involved in, so that there's sort of a group that knows what all the small groups are and how they can be of help. Yeah, but that's coming down the road, and I don't want to speak to that because I don't know enough about it. Yes, Anne.
Do I understand that the administrative team will meet sort of on an ad hoc basis? That it won't be a weekly or monthly?
Yes, that's right. And all of the administrative team might not necessarily need to meet at the same time. And it depends on who chooses to be on the administrative team. If there's people who are passionate about finances, since we won't really have a finance committee anymore, will happen in the administrative team. So maybe a couple people are people, but that's their thing. And then there's personnel and property and other things as well, but those are the three big things. So if it was a property situation, then maybe the person who's sort of more in charge of property, along with other people that are knowledgeable about property, might be the ones that would meet. So everybody wouldn't have to meet. I think that's right. Is that right? Okay. Okay, because everybody isn't going to necessarily be knowledgeable about all of the things, and so they don't all have to meet. And yes, it would be more ad hoc, though. Yes.
So the administrative team is just a list of contact people, really?
Well, I wouldn't say that exactly. No, there's only going to be, they would involve other people to have more expertise. They're not going to do all of the work, but yeah.
They don't give permission.
They don't give permission.
If you want to plant a tree, you have to talk to this person.
Well, as long as it fits into what we're already doing, then they won't give permission. No one needs permission. Okay, but they do come to that so that someone knows what's going on. We don't want people just going out and doing things. So there would be that center. And and when it comes time to do things financial, that would be the person, the group that does that. But they may get other people as well to help with it.
I know we would need to live into this, but as I hear the conversations, it either sounds like the administrative team is meeting all the time, or that people on the administrative team actually could wield a lot of individual power. I mean, they're not a power-designed committee, but if they're the ones who say, yep, that's in, no, that's out, that could be a very powerful set of individuals in the structure of the church.
Well, though, as I understand it, it really doesn't say yes or no. I mean, anything that requires a yes, a decision that's a change, goes to consistory.
As I said,
we have to live into it.
Yeah.
But I'm trying to figure out, is that a group to avoid because they're meeting all the time? Every time somebody has an idea, they have to go to that team, or not. We have to live into
Yeah.
the
Well, and
We've now got, the congregation is the biggest decision maker, the consistory is the next decision maker. Then we've got this administrative team that is the filter for those, and we've got individuals. So we're adding a lawyer maybe, or while the goal is to take out. So
well, I don't think we're adding a layer because it doesn't go from one to the other. It doesn't go from administration to consistory unless a big change is being made. But in most things that don't require a big change, administration would handle. They do handle the day-to-day, not that they necessarily need to meet all the time, but they would be more answering questions about things. Yeah, they would be more answering questions. But not all of them would have to be involved because I think their particular, like I said, personnel, they would take some of the work away from Libby for sure. Libby does a lot of administrative work. She spends a lot of time in the day doing administrative work. And these people can help with that. Having to do the assessments for the staff. Now, she'll certainly have to be involved, but the personnel would be more involved in that. She does all of that now. So one of the things should help her take some of the work that she does as well, because she does too much administration, just takes up too much of her time. So it would help with that. That's one thing. So that's personnel, would help. And looking for people like for this new job. She's saying, where do I publish that? Well, the personnel, if we had this, the personnel would be involved, or the administrative team would be involved in trying to find this new person that we're looking for the family, whatever it's called. Yeah, rather than Libby doing all that. Right now, there's nobody that does that. And I tell you, there were a number of things over this past year, a lot of them because of the pandemic, which no one expected, that I kept thinking, this is where it'd be good to have an administrative team, because it just kept coming to me. This would be good to have a team to be able to go to. But there is, but believe me, we've been meeting for well over a year and a half, and we go through these questions every time we meet. We're like, what about this? Well, what? So I understand that it's not clear on one presentation, because it's not even clear 100% to us. And we've been hearing about it and talking about it for months. So I do think we'll have to live into it, yeah. And Bruce is going to keep being available for us to help us, guide us. Ted.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
It just seems to me that if you look back 2 or 3 years ago, when Bruce first came on board, and everyone else we worked with, all the small groups.
A little closer.
I think we've come a long way to this point, and if you go back to what Mel said earlier, this whole thing may not work, but it may work. But let's give it a chance. To me, I think it's refreshing just to hear the fact that we have something to look at, something that's new. And I appreciate all the hard work that's gotten to this point. We can certainly tweak it, give it another look down the line, but just look at the big picture here. I think it's an opportunity, and I think it's good. That's just my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
I just like the fact that it's so refreshing.
Well, thank you. Yeah, that's great to hear. I appreciate that. So anybody else? Or did I not answer any questions that I tried to? Or somebody else can answer?
Can they come on the Zoom meeting on the 29th, even if they get here? Can you hear me?
Oh, sure. Anybody could come on the Zoom meeting. Yeah, we're going to have another meeting, as I said. So yeah, if you want to hear it again, hear what those people's questions are that maybe gives you more insight, you're more than welcome. Everyone will get the Zoom link. So it will be not tomorrow, but the next Monday at 7:15. 7:15. Okay, well, then everybody has it, and sure, feel free to get on it, that's fine. Yeah, okay. So, thank you very much for staying, thanks for all your good questions and for your openness to even thinking about this.